Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Liberty Show with Kevin Fortune, where you, the citizen, can raise your voice to a national platform to speak out on things on liberty, and where we promote putting our liberty into action. Tonight, we have a very special, interesting show, like always, but we got some special guests. Our one and only Louis is here, yay! And we've got a new friend, Alissa. So you're going to meet them later on. But tonight's topic is one that is dear to my heart, but one that is very essential to our nation. White people's participation or contribution, rather, to the civil rights movement. I always struggle with how do I open my shows and introduce. Well, this one was kind of easy. When we tried to promote this on Facebook, it was rejected. We reworded it, it still was rejected because the white people's contribution to civil rights, dealing with race, healing our nation, healing the divide, is not very popular, very controversial. So it was just really amazing to me that we were rejected for something that we're trying to do that would enhance this world. So it just shows how this subject is something that people do not want to talk about or deal with. So let's get started. Tonight we have our famous, world-renowned historian, Louis from up in Minnesota. Hey, Louis, you're on the Liberty Show.
I wouldn't go so far as to say world-renowned, but I appreciate the praise, even if it's a little hyperbolic.
So, Louis, you're a history major. So give us a little historical background of how white people have contributed to the civil rights movement.
So the way I've kind of outlined this discussion, and I do want it to be a discussion. I don't want it to just be like me endlessly talking. We'll have spaces for kind of some back and forth. I basically looked through American history going back to the 1600s, like the very foundations of America as kind of a national entity. And I've kind of gone through from then to modern times and looked to just basically prominent as well as not so prominent white Americans who, instead of siding with the racist status quo for one reason or another, stood with their black countrymen, so to say. So, start with the pre-revolutionary times, 1600s to sort of the 1780s, as would be implied by the word revolutionary being in the title. I wanted to discuss briefly the difference between the more conservative and I guess you would say plutocratic founding fathers, like Thomas Jefferson or George Mason, and what I've tentatively termed the left wing of the American Revolution, which is sort of embodied by people like Jeremy Bentham or Thomas Paine. And as you'd imagine, slavery was very much a dividing issue on this in terms of what separated like the radical founding fathers from like the more, the conservatives, so to say. Bentham and Paine, as well as like all of the founding fathers, really were very much figures of the Enlightenment, the 1700s, the era of liberalism, which was sort of the radical anti-establishment ideology of its day. And it sort of aimed to, in Europe at least, to unseat the entrenched power of absolute monarchies in places like France and Britain. And that sort of like energy is very much present in the American Revolution. But with people like Jeremy Bentham and Thomas Paine, they sort of were more, I guess, radical about it, more committed to it. I guess people like Jeremy Bentham and Thomas Paine, they sort of approach anti-abolitionism from a philosophical angle, from sort of a humanistic perspective. Humanism having been a big idea in the Enlightenment era. And getting back to my earlier point, guys like them sort of set a trend for kind of future white civil rights activists and abolitionists that kind of viewed the matter as like as something like intellectual and philosophical. Like they opposed slavery on those grounds because it was inconsistent with their Enlightenment era ideals. This will continue in other forms as we go on. I guess just also around this same time, kind of the late 1600s and 1700s, there was sort of not an opposing camp of abolitionists, but abolitionists who had a different perspective, which is represented by groups like the Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, and other radical Protestant sects, who condemned slavery on moral or theological grounds, basically that it was unchristian and that it was inconsistent with biblical values. And I apologize if it's slightly long-winded, but basically these two sort of opposing camps, I feel like, kind of represent an interesting dichotomy that sort of recurs in throughout American history in terms of like how different people view the matter of slavery and later on the emancipation of Black peoples.
We're going to continue, but I just want to bring out, you brought a good point that a lot of the white abolitionists, it was just a head knowledge of it's a head thing, an intellectual thing, and it really wasn't from their heart. And that's some of the stuff we see today. We see a lot of people being politically correct or let's go with the flow, but their heart is not really in it. And that is the emphasis, the foundation of this whole conversation. We're going to bring it up to today with Alissa pretty soon. But in order to see changes in our country, in order to see healing, it's going to take white and Black. It's going to take white people that created some of these problems to deal, from the white community with some of these problems. So go on quickly, go to the next session, and then we're going to bring Alissa in.
To start things off, this is now section 2, the Civil War and then the Reconstruction era, so the 1800s. And that was the thing with a lot of, I guess you would say, mainstream abolitionists, is that there was that element of kind of saviorism, I believe is the term I used earlier, where it's like slavery, the institution is evil, but the people who are enslaved, are lesser and we need to help them. And then with 19th century imperialism, not just in America, but all over the world, there was that kind of element of, compassionate, like paternalism, I guess you'd say. It's like us, dignified, like white folk need to help these poor, like non-white people. And you can see that with the Back to Africa movement, which is, somewhat popular for its time, which was just white abolitionists who felt that, Black Americans, people born in America should just be sent back to Africa, to Liberia, to just live there so they would not be a problem for the American government anymore. And it was not very successful because obviously, like, if you're Black and born in America, you're not African, if you know what I mean. Like, you're not from Africa. Africa is just some other place in that instance. And I know, Black abolitionists, from criticisms that were made of the BTA movement, sort of pointed to that fact.
Let me point out one thing. That was a good point, that a lot of this was just head knowledge versus heart. But there were a lot of whites that did contribute to helping a lot of the African-American, I guess we could call them African-Americans at that time. But this was an early precursor of what we call our libertarians. Some of these abolitionists, especially the white ones, was the early libertarians because they believed in freedom, that no other person should infringe on the rights of another person or could own another person. So that does tie into libertarianism. But before you leave, Louis, can you give us a couple examples quickly of like Bacon, the Quakers, of how people actually put their liberty into action to contribute to helping people of color?
I guess one thing I was hoping to bring up quickly is that in this era, whatchamacallit, the more radical wing of the then new Republican Party was sort of like not the left wing party of its day, but was sort of had a similar spirit to it. There were certain early radical Republicans like Charles Sumner, who you'll remember was the one senator who was famously nearly caned to death on the floor of the Senate, as well as pro-Reconstruction Republicans like James M. Hinds, who were both very vocally against slavery and did not hesitate to criticize, white conservative landowners who mostly supported the Democrats or the more pro-slavery party of the time. And in many cases, politicians who, put themselves out there like that face pretty serious consequences, not just because even like members of their own party who are more moderate were kind of reluctant to like agree to go along with their policy proposals, but also because like more than once their lives were either destroyed or ended by their opponents. I mentioned Sumner, obviously. The I think he's from South Carolinian lineage, how do you say that? Senator Preston Brooks obviously nearly killed him by beating him in the head with like a hickory cane. And James M. Hinds was one of a number of radical Republicans who was just straight up murdered by the KKK in the Reconstruction era, where, I guess getting back to your point, Kevin, that was one of the ways that, white people who use their liberties to try to like stand up for the hypothetical liberties of like non-white people, like, they would often be at the mercy of the Klan, which was basically a white Protestant nativist version of ISIS in the Reconstruction era. Not a perfect comparison, but it was basically a violent, marauding terrorist group that went around like murdering blacks mainly, but then also radical any politicians or white people who stood up for blacks, like James M. Hinds. So yeah, that would be a couple instances of like abolitionists like having skin in the game, putting aside stuff like the white Northerners who helped Harriet Tubman with the Underground Railroad, or somebody like John Brown who just straight up tried to lead an armed rebellion to try to liberate the entire enslaved population of the South. Hopefully that makes sense.
Well, those are good points as we transition, that there were people, once again, that actually put their liberty into action. They took not only their head knowledge and heart knowledge, but actually put it into action. And I'm glad you mentioned Harriet Tubman, the Underground Railroad, because we often think of the Underground Railroad, Harriet Tubman, as slaves, but there were a lot of white people, mostly white people, that really participated, that actually opened their homes up secretly, that fed them, hid them, carried them in wagons and things like that, and actually put their life in jeopardy. Like you were talking about the caning of the guy, they were actually sometimes murdered or their houses burned down, things like that. Their businesses pretty much boycotted. Their neighbors rejected them. Their families, disinherited them and things like that. So that is really a lot. Also, you had women in their sewing bees and different things that would get together and sew quilting bees, and they would quilt blankets with maps on it to like how to get up north and things like that. So a lot of people did contribute. So let's move on up into the 21st century, because as we come up, the reason we started with our historical perspective was that our nation is in trouble. We still have a lot of race issues, a lot of race problems, but for some reason, we don't even want to deal with it. And some of our leadership and administration, instead of trying to heal, has began to try to add fuel to the fire. And like I said in my introduction, the fact that even on social media, our title of white contributions to civil rights was just almost rejected. Like, let's not even deal with it, or this is a taboo subject to talk about. But we've got someone tonight, a very special guest, another renowned person, motivational speaker, podcaster, business coach, the one and only Alissa Daire Nelson. Welcome, Alissa. You're on the Liberty Show.
Well, hello. It's great to be here. This is a favorite topic of mine because it is so damn important. So I just really appreciate having the opportunity to come on and commune with you all and talk about this really, 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 I think it's the most important topic of our day, actually.
Okay. So Alissa, why do you think this is such an important topic? Let's start with that.
Yeah. I mean, when we have a system that is set up to continually oppress folks, it can't be good for the whole. And we have to address that. And our country has been very resistant to addressing that. And it's amazing to me still today, how specifically white America just has not reconciled with being ready to face this. And it's one of the reasons that I have become so incredibly outspoken, because we have to, in order for it to truly for us to truly have equality in our country, which again is good for everyone. When we have an actual equal opportunity country like our forefathers have, spoke about, but our country has never, ever, ever, not for one day, lived up to its ideals. And so I love my country, and I want us to actually work towards that. I don't hate my country, but we have a lot of issues that we have to contend with.
Let me hit on that point real quick. Then I want you to talk about how you got involved in this movement. But I think that's a very important topic, denial. There is such denial right now in our country, not only about race, about gender, about economic disparities. And people just want to, I don't want to say lie their way out, then they want to believe their own lie. Oh, it's not true. Even the stuff that what we're teaching in history and what Louis just was teaching, oh, that's not true. This never happened. And, it's just unreal. But I'm sorry, I just had to bring that out, because in order for us to move forward, we've got to come out of our denial status. Okay, so how did you get involved in this?
I would say that I've always considered myself, quote, not racist. I grew up in a good suburban white family with Christian ideals, which I always had sort of some issue with, right? When someone gave me a rule, I always asked why the rule was there, not not naturally followed the rule. And so I from birth always asked questions, right? And so while I would say that I was not racist, about 8 years ago, so this was in my early 30s, I actually heard myself say a racist comment in my head. It was during a traffic stop. Not and that fact is not lost on me either. That's a conversation for another day, but I'll just kind of explain what this comment was. And the officer was incredibly rude to me, and scared my children who were in the back seat. I was speeding, fine. I didn't deny it. Give me the ticket, fine, whatever. And my daughters asked me, "Mommy, is the police officer gonna arrest you?" And they were afraid. And I was so angry, because we'd always taught our children that the police were going to save you, right? Like if you hear sirens, because the police are going to save somebody. And obviously that is not the same sentiment or feeling that the Black community in large part has, and for very good reason. Again, conversation for another day. But the thing is, when he left, after he gave me the ticket, I put the ticket on my passenger seat, and the thought I had in my head was, what the hell? I'm a white woman with 2 kids in the back. Why would he treat me that way? Right? Now, as if my skin color was different, that it would be justified, right? And I was instantaneously horrified that I would think such a thing. And I think that story is so important, because as we look at the denial of so many white folks, they're not listening to the thoughts in their own head. And we swim in a sea of whiteness, where white, specifically white maleness, is what is normal, right? That's why we say, oh, it's a female CEO, it's a Black CEO, because that's not, quote, normal. Right? What's normal is white and male. And so until we start to grapple and actually address some of the white sea that we swim in, we can't actually reconcile or address this stuff. And so I share that story, even though it is, I've reconciled with it myself, but it took me about 5 years to share that story out loud, because I was so filled with shame about it. And what happened is that as I was filled with shame, it also paralyzed my ability to actually do more growing. And so this is what I talk to a lot of white folks about, is like, hey, we got to set the shame aside, and so that we can actually talk about this in a real way that helps us to move forward. And so, it's really just been in the last couple of years, really, that I've become more outspoken. And certainly since the murder of George Floyd, even more outspoken, because this is too important to, and there's too much urgency behind this to have one more day where we don't have this conversation. I could talk about this all day long. And one of the things that I love, Louis, about what you are talking about with regards to the historical aspect, is that there have been white accomplices. And I'm gonna, maybe this is a new term for folks watching.
We were discussing this the other evening, I remember.
Yeah, accomplices and allies are different people. And so an ally is somebody who will stand next to somebody who is being oppressed, specifically, our Black community here, saying, I support you. I want to help. I want to do the right thing. An accomplice is what Louis was talking about. People who actually put their lives on the line, and risked things in order to do the right thing. It's very action oriented, and that's what we really need right now. Yes, allies are fantastic, but what we need in this movement is white accomplices, folks who are willing to stand up to walk the line, and to really put themselves in a place of potential risk, because it is still a very volatile topic, and people are still getting hurt. What we're just a week ago, we had yet another unarmed Black man murdered by police in Texas. Like these murders continue to happen. We cannot tolerate this anymore. And we need white accomplices to stand up and join the fight. Our Black brothers and sisters have been in this fight for 400 years, and it takes all of us. And so that's why I feel so strongly about not only being an accomplice myself, but also sort of recruiting other folks to stand up, and take action in this movement.
Yeah, that's a very helpful and pertinent term to bring up here, at least from my perspective. I think especially perhaps a good viral example of that happened recently was this photo from the protests in Portland, I believe, where it's this line of policemen, and it's this white woman naked, like exposing herself in front of this brutality, and sort of the mythos of this sort of delicate white body of this woman is able to kind of totally destabilize this brutality and kind of dissolve it there. So that was one example of that I thought sort of exemplified that kind of behavior.
It's a very interesting example, and I think that woman actually turned out to be Asian. Not that it's neither here nor there, but what she was really working towards was the power of femininity, which is something that is also really important. White femininity specifically has been weaponized, for all of our country's history, and really crescendoed with Emmett Till's murder. And yet it's still, the Amy Coopers of the world still exist, right? Where white women know that innately, right? And they don't even have to know it overtly or consciously. They know it innately, that they have power to put others at risk, because of who they are. And again, that's why I call it weaponized white femininity. And we have to stop that. And so, I, for one, am taking a stand and saying, I will not weaponize my white femininity anymore. I never did it intentionally, certainly. But I'm certain that there were times in my life where just on the basis of unawareness, I did some things like that, right? And we don't know what we don't know until we begin to take a look and actually show ourselves, right? It's this self-awareness, and racism, is a heart issue first, right? And so as I am out and I'm sort of doing the work, I'm encouraging people to just open up their hearts and let's have a conversation. The action comes after the hearts are opened. And we have to take it to action. It's not good enough just to go, oh, well, my heart is better and I'm now woke. It doesn't happen in one moment. It happens woke moment after woke moment after woke moment. And, I will be learning and unlearning for the rest of my life. I will never stop learning. And I think that that's an important piece to contend with as well. There is not a single woke moment where suddenly you're healed of racism. No, because this is what we swim in on a daily basis, and this is why it's systemic racism. We don't have to actually be actively, burning crosses in yards and wearing, KKK attire in order to be racist, because the system is set up to be racist.
Yeah, thank you for that, Alissa. This is such a helpful discussion. So I think we're going to transition to some questions and comments now, but I'm sure we'll come back to you and keep roping your voice into this. So
David, my main man down in Fort Lauderdale, how are you? How's my favorite Republican and conservative? I wanted to talk because, when we were talking about the subject of whites' contribution to the civil rights movement, a lot of times, especially today, we see these so-called conservatives and Republicans. Some of them come across as racist. They come across as discriminating or in denial. But I think you are a real Republican. I know I used to be my housemate, and you're a real conservative, but you've never, ever been racist. You've had people of color as housemates. I know that you have went way out of your way to help people of color, homeless people. You have taken home and let them live with you and fed them and paid people's rents and paid for people's funerals and plane tickets, and really have just spent your life really fighting for civil rights. And I think that's part of the puzzle a lot of times that people do leave out. So talk about that a little bit.
Okay, again, we've got to give you a little bit of background on me. I grew up in the 60s, so that makes me ancient to most of your crowd. But I went to parochial school. And so I had the nuns teach me a few lessons in life. I was unwoke when my dad took me across his knee and said the world didn't revolve around me. I was unwoke when the nuns pulled me by the ear and dragged me down the hall. I was taught to respect others. It didn't matter if you went out to a friend's house and they were Chinese and there was somebody that was Irish there, somebody that was Black. It didn't matter. They all had something special to bring to the table. And if you didn't recognize that, you weren't being much of a friend. And so just because I help people, I look at them that we all bleed red. And I've used that expression since I went to college in 1971. We all bleed red. And if we treat people with respect and help others when they need it, that's an important way of dealing with society. I have a little trouble with the woke.
David, let me ask you this. So what do you think is happening today as far as a lot of the Republicans that are so anti-Mexican or Latino, anti-Black? Even if people have problems, you don't take a whole race, the whole Chinese, and just throw them down. What do you think of, because I don't even call these people Republicans or conservatives. I don't know what they are. But what do you think of that? That some of the hatred, especially on Fox News, some of it, I know that's just entertainment, but what do you think of that?
I think a lot of people don't want to hear what they're really trying to say. They've closed down the conversation because part of the problem is you have too many that won't open it up and say, hey, what do you think? What do you think about being Black, becoming a Republican? What do you think about being Chinese? But I always learned that the Cubans came over because they were looking for freedom. And they did it the right way. They came because they were allowed to, as long as they made it to the shore and we opened our doors. But a nation can't survive if you don't have borders. I don't care what you say. We've got governors that got gates around their homes. We've got Gates, Bill Gates. How many fences does he have in his home? So we're getting off the subject. What I think you really want to hear is that society can change, but each of us individually have to change. And that should have been taught to us when we were young. And my dad taught me more lessons for a man who was very simple. I am a very simple man, but he was a disabled vet, he walked with wooden prosthesis on 2 legs. And I watched what he did. My dad, with somebody else from the church, got together with people of color to make sure that they could buy a home. That because they were Black, that kept the banks from wanting to get them their name on it, so that communities would shut the door and they would barricade Blacks from coming into the suburbs. So I knew my dad took a stand on something. And I realized, again, that reinforced the notion that we are all created equal. The Black people I helped, I may have not been friends with them, but I became friends with them. Some of them, I realized that they had a disability, and I just went out of my way to help them. Then they stumbled and had financial problems. But I never had a barrier. It could have been a Chinese person. It could have been a Mexican. I married a Cuban. So the best we can do for society now is start with young children. You're not going to change older people. And these 28-year-olds that are protesting, what are they protesting for? What are they accomplishing? They're destroying, they're not building. So a lot of that, Portland, Seattle, what's the percentage of Black and white in those cities? So who's actually doing the protesting?
Well, let me ask you one final question before you go, Dave. Recently, our president, and then I've actually seen some TV evangelists really shocked me. They're promoting that a lot of this historical stuff that Louis was talking about with slavery and injustice is not real. What do you say to that? You know, when people want to say that we haven't discriminated, our nation was this great, perfect country, it's a great Christian nation, but they don't want to talk about the abuse of slaves, the Jim Crow laws or whatever. What do you think of that?
I think they're trying to scrub history. They're not realizing that there's some things that have been left out, and that needs to be torn down, or the fable has to be corrected. But there was a reason why a Black man was only counted as 6/10 or 3/10 of a person. That was to force the southern states to recognize that you're not going to get federal dollars unless you change. And so that's not being taught. All the Black person, remember, I'm not counted as a full person. No, it was to hit the racist in the pocket, the rich plantation owner. So there's a lot of, the history gets debated. It's never cut and dry because you're looking over your shoulder. If we look forward as what I can do today, how can I help society? Can I be proactive? Not an activist, be proactive. And that's how I do it.
I agree with you, but one thing, in order for us to move forward, we have to look to the back, look back over our shoulder, and you can't take back history, but at least you can't be in denial. But thank you, David, great points. But on that, I want to switch to my main man, DK, not the murderer, but Damon, you're kind of an expert in this area. Damon, welcome back. You're on the Liberty Show.
Hey, welcome. Appreciate you having me on, Kevin. Love your show as always. Love your guests. And if I didn't take notes on what Alissa was saying, I didn't know how powerful she was going to be, man. But she came with some zingers, man. What I personally wanted to bring to the conversation was that in Trump's America, it's very easy for Black folks to want to pigeonhole all white people as being racist, because there seem to be a lot of them out there. But I think that we got to sometimes turn the TV off and understand that there are a lot of good people. Because when I grew up, kind of like what David said, I went to a parochial school growing up. And I knew a lot of white folks who were cool then and were cool to this day. On Facebook, I'm kind of able to see their outward support, as Alissa was pointing to, being an ally. And Alissa, what was your term that you said for?
Accomplice.
Accomplice, yes. Mm-hmm. So that is a perfect way to say it. With all of these issues going on with George Floyd and stuff like that, a lot of white people there's multiple ways they can go with it. They can either ignore it, act like it's not there, or they can speak out vocally and say this is not right. And the purpose of this podcast tonight is to talk about, throughout history, white people's contributions to the civil rights movement and to equality. And in Trump's America, to kind of bring it back, present day, there are so many white folks who are good people, who are actually living up to the Christian principles, who are speaking out against what they're seeing today in the injustices. And contrast that with a lot of these quote unquote evangelicals who support Trump. If you had to create a game where you would pick a person that is so anti-Christian principles, I mean, you couldn't do better than Trump. I mean, the man he's an adulterer, he's a misogynist, xenophobe. He's every pretty much negative adjective you can assume, and he is all of that. But yet somehow he has the evangelical Christian right vote on lock. I have no idea how to say it, other than the fact that these people are deep down hardcore racists. And like Alissa said, we all have the ability to have thoughts that are not necessarily right. And that's not wrong in and of itself, but we've got to be able to check ourselves. And so if something happens to you, in a perfect world, we don't even have race at all, because the history of this country was created from a basis of white supremacy kind of built into the cake of America. And for us to acknowledge that is not to chastise and make all white people feel bad, but it's merely a statement of fact, right? And so what we need to do is address the historic injustices and then move forward as a people. Because at the end of the day, if you take the poor white person in Alabama who acts like he's pro-Trump, what he does not realize, and not to call him stupid, but I mean, it doesn't make sense to me that Trump is a trust fund baby from New York who basically has been given everything in his entire life, but yet you, who don't really have much money, you identify with him. If you were on fire, he would not piss to put the fire out. But yeah, you basically love him and you kiss his ass. But the reality is not to try to slander those type of people, but at the end of the day, they have more in common with Black folks, and we have strength in numbers as far as trying to make this country a better place. Because the people at the top, the upper echelon of economics in this country, they look with equal disdain on Blacks and white folks. Now, when they talk bad about Black folks, that's to try and curry up favor with the poor whites who think that if they can just act puff their chest out and say, hey, I'm white, I'm better than these Black folks, they're going to get some special prize or some cookie. They don't like you either, right? So at the end of the day, if we can all come together, Black, white, gay, straight, Mexican, Christian, whatever, we're all better together with unity. But we've got to understand that the past, we can't just ignore and act like it hasn't happened. We got to bring it into the future, in the present day, and then move into the future as one collective people, not just Black, not just white, whatever. But we can't ignore what has happened systemically that has given white people a leg up on Black folks. And that's pretty much, I'm gonna leave it at that. I know other people got to talk.
Well, don't go anywhere. But I want to piggyback off of that. Back to even Louis, and Damon brought up a good point that most of the racism of our country is only from, as Louis would say, the upper 1% or whatever. Actually, even in slavery days, only like 10 to 20% of white people owned slaves. I remember I had a friend one time said, well, I feel bad, Kevin, my grandfather probably owned your grandfather. I said, probably not, because most white people did not own slaves. And the ones that did only own 1 or 2 slaves. This large Gone with the Wind type slavery stuff, that's Hollywood. And you cannot get your history from Hollywood. Is that right, Louis? I'm going to go back to Alissa, and then I want to hear some feminine point of views, maybe Miss Charlie or Miss Jackie to talk. But Alissa, sorry about that little hiccup. I can't control the weather. I can control many things, but I can't control the weather. did you, while I was gone, did you talk about the feminine or even the sexual point of view from white women? Would you go into that?
Yeah, we did talk about weaponized white femininity specifically. And Damon, thank you so much for all of your excellent points and just calling out the bullshit, right? One of my friends, as we were talking about systemic racism, he said, a term that I actually prefer, and is a black friend of mine, is systemic placism. And I think, and I've begun to use that term with my white counterparts to help them get over this idea that that they didn't have any obstacles. Like, just because that's not what white privilege is about, is that you didn't have any obstacles. Of course, we all have obstacles, but my skin color is not one of them. And so, racism was put in place in order to keep people in their place, according to who the people in power at that time, who were all white males, wanted, right? And there's a really great book called Dying of Whiteness. The author is Jonathan Metzl. Fantastic book. And it goes into, look, racism is hurting you too, white folks. like it's not good for anybody. And so I just think it's really important to underscore that obstacles don't mean that you haven't had challenges. So I'm messing all this up. I'm just stumbling over my own words because I just get so frustrated about this, as white folks really push back against this whole white privilege thing. And the fact of the matter is that things have been set up in our favor. From day
one, as Louis said.
From day one. And I grew up in a family of 7
to the present.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I grew up in a family of 7 kids. We didn't have a lot of money, right? I started working when I was 11 years old. And yes, I had and have white privilege, right? Doesn't mean I didn't work my ass off. What it means is that my skin color was not an additional barrier. And oh, by the way, I don't have to be afraid for my life when I get pulled over by police. And so I think these are all things that white folks have to start to address. And one of the ways that I begin to address this with white folks is without name calling, right? Because name calling assigns an identity to folks, and along if you resist that identity, you immediately go into a shame spiral. Brene Brown talks a lot about shame versus guilt. Guilt is about your behavior, right? So rather than call someone a racist, because it might be true, but it's just not helpful, I say that was a racist comment. Let's talk about that behavior, that comment, that thought, that belief. And now we can actually have a functional conversation about that particular thing. So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you, Damon, for calling out Trumpism for what it is, first of all. And, also the point about, thankfully, white folk or black folks just want equality. Like, no one's looking for revenge. And quite frankly, I wouldn't blame a whole lot of folks for wanting revenge. That would be justified. And so the resilience and the forgiveness and the grace that the Black community has provided is really quite incredible.
Okay, thank you. We don't go anywhere. Can we get a feminine point of view? Miss Charlie or Jackie, do you guys have anything to say? Are they there?
Hey, Kevin.
Hey,
it's Charlie.
Hey. How are you?
I'm doing well. What
do you think of this conversation?
It's a beautiful conversation. You know what I mean? It's, everybody on here and nobody truly wants to be racist, or we don't, we're just loving one another and race. But it's like, I guess my question is, or I'm trying to figure out, even though there was a, supposedly from back in the day, people didn't believe in slavery and things of that nature, but it continued to happen. And I guess with all of us and all of this goodness, to me, it's almost like those that don't see it or they do still see color. It's more of them than it is of us, apparently, that don't see color, because to me, it's just pretty words. I don't know, because the same bullshit keeps happening. And I'm tired of the bullshit constantly happening. Oh, I'm just, I'm not racist and we're all good people. But still, we're the ones still getting stepped on, dumped on, killed, murdered. And when does enough become enough? And and then sometimes I'm like, and I hate to say this, it's like, but shit, do we need revenge? Is that the only way that they're gonna, if somebody black died, then somebody white have to die for them to understand? And I hate having to say that, but I feel like we're at a point where what else can we do? Because I don't think conversations are really working.
Well, I agree. And my thing is, when are we going to stop having conversations and have some action? And I mean, right. That is a really good point, that people, we talk one thing, but sometimes we do another. And that's the problem. Like even with President Trump, I hear what he's saying, but I also see what you're saying. I see his actions, and they're not always lined up with his mouth. Even a lot of so-called Christians, I love you, you're my brother, doesn't always line up with the way they've treated people and things like that. But Miss Charlie, will you share with the audience about your husband? So let us know, like, you're coming from a very different point of view.
I know. Actually, well, my husband is Italian American, so and we sometimes have these conversations a lot. Sometimes they can become intense because I keep trying to get him to understand. Yes, your family, your grandparents were immigrants. They chose to come here, right. To have a better life. That's not necessarily the case. So it's like you're trying to compare apples to oranges, and then you want to stay in this moment. And, just like everybody else, oh, but my family didn't do this, or, just like, I hate to say this, some white people, my family, that was back in the day. But that same back in the day, there's still an effect of it now.
I totally agree.
You're benefiting from that which happened back in the day, and you don't want to. Sometimes you got to go back to the root of a problem to solve that problem. And most people, it seems, don't want to go back to that root. And then I think you have just some white people, even though they're poorer than poor, and and they're out here following Trump, this and the other, but they prefer to live in that delusional world. But hey, I'm white, and we're still better, and we're still the superior race, and that's apparently that's what you want. Right.
Delusional world. And I agree that, I love that better than denial. We're delusional because denial, yes. It's right in front of your face, but we choose to step over it and just push it out the way and just be delusional. Exactly. So I love that. I'm stealing that from you, Miss Charlie.
You can have it, Kevin. Thank you.
Well, no, those are so many great points. And, I just think of it from the feminine point of view. You bring up a whole, because especially Black females have went through even more. Females in general in our nation have been mistreated and discriminated against. But then you're a Black female, you're a poor Black female, or a gay Black female. Oh my God, you got just double, triple, quadruple whammies. And to get back to Alissa, one reason that I was glad to have her on our show is that white women have played such a role in a lot of the injustices of when they've accused falsely Black men of raping them, or when white men accused Black men of falsely raping, whatever. But they also had a great movement, I think Louis alluded to, in abolitionists, because they also were considered property. They were discriminated against. And there's a really good book by Valerie Martin called Property. It's like the diary of a white plantation owner's wife, and how, she felt when her husband was having sex or raping, making babies with the slaves, and she's alone, she's lonely, and how she couldn't, pay bills or do things. But a lot of the white women got together with their quilting bees and their little church groups, and they began to say, this isn't right. When you begin to sell people's kids, their race went, their humanity and their femininity overrode their even the color of their skin. So Alissa, will you address that a little bit, that how, white women, their special role in what they can do to heal our nation or bring awareness to this? Can you address that a little?
Yeah, no, I think what's really interesting is, all of the movements, and we can talk about the right to vote, et cetera, where women, right, Black women and white women, really created these, and actually to a large degree, Black women were leading these movements to for the right to vote, et cetera. And then what white women did was they came in and went like, oh, hey, thanks for doing the work, and we're just gonna monopolize this and take this over, and we're gonna shove you to the side. And so this weaponized white femininity has been used not just against Black men, but also against Black women. And who was the benefactors of things like Title IX and a lot of the civil rights movement and the right to vote, et cetera. It was white women first and foremost, and then as we, and obviously I'm only 41 years old, so I was not around here in 1920. But what we did as white women is we were like, hey, this works for us, so now we're just going to take this and run with it. And what a slap in the face when it comes to other populations that have been oppressed. And that also has to stop. And we, white women, have to do a lot of that reconciliation as well, to say, hey, I acknowledge that what happened was super shitty. And let's take action to rectify that. Let's take action to make that, so that it doesn't occur anymore. And yes, women have been property. They didn't have the right to vote. They didn't have the right to, create wealth oftentimes.
Right.
But nonetheless, so it's important. Like, we recognize that there has been some oppression there. And so those of us who are in populations that have been oppressed ever, we should get this. We should understand it. And yet it is still a conversation that people just can't get. I mean, it's astonishing to me, white women who still support Trump. I don't get it. But that's, again, another conversation for another day.
Okay. Well, we're going to all get straightened out. My other main man, our research director, criminal justice supervisor, national director of putting everybody in their place, Mr. Tim. Welcome, Tim. You're back on the Liberty Show.
Thank you. I truly appreciate it. And a big shout out to our hosts. Just to quickly go through this, to David's point earlier, David hit on something that a lot of white folks like to do. And they like to pick out one group and say, listen, this group did it right, so the rest of y'all need to get on board and do it right also. And he brought up the Cubans. Well, the Cubans immigrated to this country correctly or legally, and we have to have borders, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I am a proud Miami Cuban. Shout out to Hialeah, West 49th Street. Very proud of my Miami Cuban heritage, if you will. But it's disingenuous to state that the Cubans came over here correctly when they had a foot up. And the way they had a foot up was in the wet foot, dry foot. That is a law. It is a system that's put in place that allowed the Cubans, as long as they were able to put one foot on sand on Haulover Beach in Miami or wherever it was that they stepped foot on, they were entitled to citizenship here in this country. But then when we look at the Haitians suffered unfairly. The Haitians were persecuted in their own country also. But when the Haitians came over to this country, well, there's no wet foot and dry foot, wet foot or dry foot policy for you all. So David brought up or made a point that a lot of white folks in this country like to bring up, is that if you do things the right way, this country will reward you. And Black folks, that hasn't been our experience. Black folks, if you listen to the callers today, one, I believe it was Alissa, our guest, she made the point that she is astonished. She is surprised that Black folks have been so forgiving. Well, the reason why Black folks are so forgiving in this country is because Christianity has been weaponized against us. We've been taught to turn the other cheek, whereas white folks, and this is the disconnect between poor white folks and Black folks. Poor white folks understand the benefits of having your AR-15. Poor white folks understand the benefit of having a case full of ammo. Whereas Black folks, we've been taught, no, Jesus told you to turn the other cheek. So when this white person who hates you merely because you're black, merely because you look different than him, or that white cop. And let's be honest, it's the state that now keeps the black man down. The state has always done it, but I'm much more concerned about a cop. And here's the thing, the pigs can be a black pig, it could be a white pig. It doesn't make a color what the pig is a pig. So whether it's a black cop who pulls me over, or it's a white cop that pulls me over, because I'm black, I don't have the privilege, as Alissa realized, that, hey, I'm a white woman. And this is the disconnect. And I'm thankful that Alissa brought this out between, if you look at the white feminist movement, and let's be honest, the feminist movement is segregated. The white feminist movement does not look like the black feminist movement. The black feminist movement is saying, hey, don't shoot my son in the back. Hey, don't shoot my brother in the back. Hey, get your neck off of my father. Whereas the white feminist movement is, hey, let me into your boardroom. Hey, why can't I be the CEO? So Alissa made a beautiful point about how white folks, and this is the thing, and people will claim that I'm a racist. I'm not a racist. I love white folks. I am a fighter for the poor whites. I love white people. So this has nothing to do about me being a racist, but we have to call a spade a spade. And this is the problem that we have in this country, is that we've never had a quote unquote come to Jesus movement. We've wanted to be kumbaya and be friendly with everyone and hold hands. And this holding of hands has kept us from being honest with each other.
Hey, but Tim, I agree. We have had a come to Jesus movement, but it's been this come to this white Jesus movement. You agree? It's come to this white Jesus the way we want you to come. Do you agree with that? It's not everybody's Jesus. It's the white people's Jesus. What do you think of that?
That's tough. And here's the reason why it's tough. Do I believe Jesus Christ is blonde-haired and blue-eyed? Of course not. The Bible tells us he had hair as lamb's wool. In fact, his hair was like my hair. When I run my hands through my beautiful gray hair, it feels like lamb's wool. It also states that he had dark skin. But when I go to a church, and pick any church, whether it's a black church or a white church, I'm looking at a blonde hair and blue-eyed Jesus. So do I believe that Jesus is blonde hair? No. And at the end of the day, if you want to worship blonde hair and blue-eyed Jesus, you go in peace and you worship white Jesus with blue eyes and blonde hair. But that brings that point to this, or brings up the point that blacks, it's been institutionalized in us to treat or to believe that we're lesser than whites. And one of the ways, and we've talked about this in the past, one of the ways that the system has kept us down is through screwing us over when it came to what Christianity is, and I'll leave it at that.
Well, you don't get off that easy. I want to transfer our last conversation. It's going to be a little tough, but just take a drink or a puff or whatever you do to calm down. But I think Alissa alluded to the sex issue and everything, and one of the biggest problems. I just never understood racism. I grew up, with white friends, black friends, and there's some black people I can't stand. There's some white people I can stand. There's some family members. Sometimes I don't even like myself. But, there was a really good book I read. A guy, I think he just died a couple of years ago, Winthrop Jordan. He was a famous historian, Louis, and he studied for like 65 years, racism, white, black, and just compared black families, white families, and he wrote a book called The White Man's Burden. And the whole impetus of almost all of the racism was mainly from poor white males. And it stemmed from the fact that when the British went down and, quote, discovered Africa, even though Africa was there for millions of years before that, and they saw the black male body parts and the women's body parts, they were so intimidated, so jealous. And realistically, sometimes men, we think with our private parts. And this is something that it's a conversation you don't want to have. But until we can, get past our male, white male, black male sexuality and the intimidation and all of this, because a lot of times they don't see our brains. They don't see our how much money we got in the bank. They see that person's I got a bigger elbow than I do or something. So Alissa, You have really enlightened us and opened our eyes. You've got the last minutes on the Liberty Show. Go ahead, straighten us out. Where do we go from here?
Look at that. I love that I get to close it down here. To piggyback off of what Louis is talking about, a divided people is easy to rule. And you know, this change, like I said, racism, I believe is a heart issue first. It didn't start out that way, right? It started out as a economic construct. All right. But at this point, racism is a heart issue. And so it has to be dealt with one-to-one, one conversation at a time, et cetera. And when that grassroots movement, you know, if each one reaches one, right, that can explode and create real change. But one of the things that Trump has been very, very good at is dividing people, and a divided people is easy to rule. That wasn't on accident that occurred. So I want to circle back a little bit to the objectification of the Black body, and the reason that it is so important to address this. So
right,
really, the male Black body has been put into two categories, largely. Right, one is one is sex object. One is sex object, and the other is criminal. And both are objectified. And when we objectify people, we make them less human. And as soon as somebody is less than human, now we don't have to treat them well. And you know, and I meet a lot of quite racist white women who are like, well, I dated a Black man, or I have Black children, or I'm married to a Black man. And somehow that token, that they can check that off and say, oh, I can't be racist because X, Y, and Z. And that's right. That's exactly right. And that's just simply not true. And we have to not allow that to be the excuse to remain racist. That, well, I have, and we've heard it from all kinds of, I have one Black friend, right? Oh, my Black friend said this, or, and that's just not good enough anymore. And so, you know, as we enter into conversations, I think one of the most helpful things to do is, as soon as we see the Black body being objectified, right, that's when we really need to speak up and say, hey, you know, he's more than his body parts.
Hey, well, I'm gonna let you finish, but that's the point that I was bringing up. And like Jackie, so there's parts we don't want to talk about, and especially the Black male body and this sexuality and all of this stereotype, good or bad, right or wrong. But it is in the way of people seeing us as human beings or equality or whatever, you know. And I think of me growing up, that I was very good looking, and I still am actually. But you know, I was very smart too. I'm a great businessman, got plenty of money, good Christian, good honor. But nobody saw that, you know. I had friends, if I sit too close to their girlfriend, or even at church one time, you know, they say, turn and hug the person. I hugged this white man's wife, and this man, I thought he was going to lynch me. I mean, he just turned purple, red, pink, and green. So, you know, it is very real. And I agree with you that we have to start having these conversations one at a time, but we've got to also have, as you said, some of these tough conversations and talk about some of this stuff. But go ahead and finish, wrap us up. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, and what I think is going to be interesting is how the case of Jonathan Price plays out. So Jonathan Price, as hopefully you all know at this point, was murdered by a white police officer last Saturday, and he happens to be a really good-looking man. He was a bodybuilder, personal trainer, et cetera. And I'm super curious to see how the narrative goes, because he is easy to look at. You know, and not only that, he was obviously he was an upstanding citizen. He didn't have a criminal background. So we didn't hear anything about this case for about 3 days. Why? Because they were searching for a way to criminalize him. And not only that, he was also pro-police. And so, you know, 3 days later, they had to charge the police officer. There was no way for them to justify, you know, his murder. And so, you know, I'm watching this case, and I'm curious to see how it plays out, because once body cam footage gets out and all these white women see this very attractive Black man get murdered unjustifiably. There's no way to justify it. And will we get body cam footage? I don't really know, right? We haven't seen it yet. Will that be enough? Right. And we've talked several times tonight about when is enough? Like, whose murder has to happen for us to say enough is enough? I think we all hoped that it would be George Floyd. And clearly it's not, because there's been more and more murders since Memorial Day. And so, how do we move forward? How do we say enough is enough? And when is it, when is it going to be enough for, other side note, I really believe that white women are a massive key to the civil rights movement, not because we're wonderful and the saviors and everything else, but because, again, our Black folks have already been in this fight, and white women are influential because a lot of us white women live with white men. And so, my husband and I have had a lot of really difficult conversations, especially in the last 6 months. And it has allowed him to grow, but it's been because I've been pressing that. Right. And I think that that's the power and the influence that white women have in the home. I'm raising two white teenagers, white daughters as well. And side note, they're fantastic and also very anti-racist, and they're great. But you gotta, like, women are the ones nurturing that next generation. So, we have to step up and really begin to use our influence and our voice. And this is the thing that white women need to understand overtly, is just how powerful their voice is. And to use it in the right way instead of in a way that harms folks.
Well, thank you so much, Alissa. And you sure used your voice tonight. We're going to definitely have you back. Matter of fact, Tim and I are working on something about race and capitalism with you, and we're going to really look forward to that show. And once again, thank you, Louis. You also are awesome. And Jared, you have the final word. We want to thank Jared Morningstar, our producer, director, choreographer, makeup artist, musical director. Send us out, Jared.
Yeah, this was a wonderful conversation. So many different perspectives, but all very insightful and needed here. So I was glad we were able to come together and figure out how each of us in our own way could perhaps contribute more to this cause of civil rights. So thank you all.
Good night.